You're tuned into the Spot Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs went 2-1 in their last 3 games and earned an NBA Cup Quarterfinals qualification. How the Spurs are doing through 7 games without Victor Wembanyama. Welcome back to another episode of the Spot Up Pod. I am recording this episode late on Monday evening, so let's jump right into this episode. So I want to first discuss the last 2 games for the San Antonio Spurs, in which they did earn a qualification for the NBA Cup. Let's go back to Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. The Spurs are on the road at Portland. The Blazers were favored by 1.5 points in this game. So this is an important game for the Spurs and the Friday game after that, because the Spurs needed to win both their games on the road in Denver and in Portland in order to qualify for the NBA Cup by winning Group C. So they actually did just that. So let's begin with the Portland game. So the Spurs end up defeating Portland by 13 points, pulling away in the second half. They really relied on their defense in this game, holding the Blazers to 102 points. De'Aaron Fox had a season-high 37 points, including 14 paint points, which is also a season-high in paint scoring. Devin Vassell helped him out there with 23 points as well in the starting lineup. And rookie Dylan Harper made his return to the court after missing 10 games due to a left calf strain, playing only 17 minutes in the game. So, again, the Spurs came out with that win against Portland on Wednesday last week before Thanksgiving. Now let's move to Friday. The Spurs are on the road in Denver. The Nuggets were favored by 7.5 points. That is the most points that the Spurs have been underdogs by so far in this early season. So this was obviously the big game, being tested against Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, Cameron Johnson. Even though the Nuggets didn't have Aaron Gordon or Christian Brown, the Spurs were still without Victor Wembanyama and De'Aaron Fox. So the Spurs, this is an incredible game for them. They made an 18-point second-half comeback where Denver led early in the third quarter by 18 points. So the Spurs came back to defeat the Nuggets in crunch time, 139-136. So this game qualified. By winning this game, the Spurs qualified for the quarterfinals in the NBA Cup. Devin Vassell had one of the best games of his early career, and the reason why I say that is because he did end up with a season-high 35 points. Maybe that wasn't his career high, but this is a very meaningful game for him. This is basically win and qualify, or lose and you're out of trying to get into the NBA Cup. So again, I think for as much as the Spurs really haven't been to like the postseason during Vassell's years with the team, at least this is a very, very important game, and he came through in this game, making 7 of 9 triples. He really took control in crunch time, where with the game tied, he first makes a catch and shoot 3, then he gets another catch and shoot 3 there in crunch time with less than 1.5 minutes. He also made some key free throws down the stretch. I actually did a film breakdown over on the spotupshot.com if you want to check that out regarding Vassell's clutch time threes. Julian Champagnie also had a season high scoring night with 25 points, and he had pulled down his third double-double of the season with 10 rebounds. So again, very big game for Vassell there to help the Spurs make that comeback and then end up winning that game against Denver. So let's talk a little bit about where the Spurs are now in the NBA Cup. So by getting the win, the Spurs do qualify for the quarterfinals, where they will be playing the Los Angeles Lakers in LA on Wednesday, December 10th, because the Spurs ended up with the 3 seed in the tournament format and the Lakers ended up with the 2 seed. The winner of this game on Wednesday, December 10th, moves on to the semifinals in Las Vegas, Nevada. So again, that's going to be a big game on Wednesday, December 10th. If the Spurs or Lakers end up losing this game, well, then they're just going to play one more regular season game against another team. So the Spurs, you have to give them credit. They ended up winning a very, very tough Group C, what people have been calling the Group of Death, that featured really good teams in there, like the Houston Rockets. The Blazers have been better than expected this season. Of course, the Denver Nuggets, and then also the Golden State Warriors. So the Spurs ended up beating the Rockets, the Blazers, and the Nuggets, and their only loss was to the Warriors. So again, it's just very incredible that they won those last 2 against Portland and Denver, considering that they were without both Victor Wembanyama and Stephon Castle. Now let's move on to the most recent loss for the Spurs, which was Sunday in Minnesota. Something about these Sunday games and the Spurs on the road, and they ended up losing these games. So the Wolves were favored by 4.5 points. They had all of their core players available. The Spurs, of course, were missing Wemby and Stephon Castle. So this was very much like the road loss for the Spurs the previous Sunday against the Phoenix Suns, where the Spurs led against the Suns for most of that game by like for 3.5 quarters. But then the Suns came back in the final end of the third quarter and won the entire fourth quarter to end up winning winning that game. And this is a very similar game where the Spurs had control for the first 3 quarters. Then all of a sudden, the fourth quarter comes. The Wolves end up outscoring San Antonio 36-19 to win comfortably by 13 points. The issue for San Antonio was the 3-ball, both on offense and defense. So the Spurs matched their season low in both 8 made threes and just 24% three-point accuracy. All of their key shooters were cold from the game. Devin Vassell went 1 of 9. Julian Champagnie went 1 of 6. And Harrison Barnes went 1 of 4. And I call those 3 players the key shooters because those are the players the Spurs typically rely on to shoot the 3-ball for the team. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Wolves made 46% of their threes in this game, and they outscored the Spurs by 27 points from the 3-point line. When I looked at the wide open 3 data a day later, which is today, Monday, the Wolves 73% of the Wolves' three-point attempts were wide open. Now, that is a season high in opponent percentage of three-point attempts left wide open. So, again, the Wolves really carved up the Spurs' defense, with San Antonio trying to, either send doubles or trap Anthony Edwards, or sending doubles toward Julius Randle whenever he got inside the paint. And those players kicked the ball out. The Wolves sprayed the ball around. They ended up getting a lot of good looks. Again, 73% of their threes were wide open, and they shot 52% on those wide open threes. And so the 3-ball defense has been an issue for San Antonio so far in this early season. Coach Johnson was asked about, what happened in that game, and he basically said regarding the threes for the Wolves that, the rotations were basically very late. Whenever your game plan is to like double or send some trapping action toward playmakers like Ant or Julius Randle, you have to be ready. Your backline defense of players shifting and staying on a line, and so he said that the Spurs were basically late on a lot of the rotations. On offense for the Spurs, Keldon Johnson had another big night with 22 points off the bench. De'Aaron Fox was going really early in the first half, really driving into the paint, getting around Rudy Gobert with the use of Luke Kornet's screens, where Fox scored 19 of his 25 points in the first half. But then in the second half, the Wolves started to trap him more, started to send more double teaming action, and so he had to get the ball out of his hands more. Then the Spurs kind of ran a little bit more of the offense through Devin Vassell, who did end up with 22 points, but a lot of his scoring came from the mid-range, where he scored 10 points of kind of just using the pick and roll to kind of get some open space against Rudy Gobert's drop defense. But he did struggle from outside, like I mentioned. And then Dylan Harper, for this being his 3rd game back from injury, he had a big night with 17 points off the bench. He just continued to carve his way inside the lane, either using his speed, using his physicality, his creativity to kind of absorb contact. He had multiple first half drives against Rudy Gobert, getting inside and finishing layups. There was possessions in the second half where he kind of just took the ball down court, got away from his defender, and then met another big at the rim, usually Naz Reid, and then he would also still finish a layup there. So he ended up scoring 16 paint points, which matched his season high that he had against the Brooklyn Nets early in the season. So even though the Spurs didn't get that win against Minnesota, I would still consider this a good week for San Antonio in these 3 games because they surpassed expectations. Vegas's expectations. Vegas had them going 0-3 as underdogs in all 3 of these games, and I even said they would go 1-2, but they outperformed those expectations, going 2-1 by getting that win, getting very important wins both in Portland and in Denver to qualify for the quarterfinals of the NBA Cup. All right, for our second topic, let's talk about 7 games for the Spurs without Victor Wembanyama. So the Spurs already did release their injury report for Tuesday versus Memphis. Wemby will be missing his 8th game in a row due to the left calf strain that he's dealing with. So regarding his awards eligibility, he can only miss 9 more games this season because if a player misses 17 games, then they end up not qualifying for the postseason awards or the end of year awards. Regarding Stephon Castle, who's dealing with the hip flexor injury, he's going to miss his 7th game. Now, one thing to note about Wemby's left calf strain is that this is the same injury as Dylan Harper, maybe not to the same degree of Harper's injury, but we did see that Harper came back within 10 games. So again, Wemby's about to miss his 8th game. Who knows when he's coming back? Maybe it is 10 games. We don't know. So basically, Coach Johnson was asked about he and Stephon Castle and their progress before that game against the Minnesota Timberwolves on Sunday, and he said this. Coach Johnson, some of his key takeaways. He said that both players are progressing and that they're already on the court, doing on-court activities. That's very notable, and they're doing really well in those activities. And so they're continuing to ramp up. And he just said that they're still they're basically doing these on-court activities, and then they're basically seeing day by day how they're reacting to these on-court activities. So again, that's a good sign that they're both on the floor, at least starting to get some on-court activities. But we don't know exactly when Wemby and Castle will be back. And so that's why I do want to kind of talk about this data and how the Spurs have done so far without Wemby, because we don't know how long he's still going to be out. So Through 7 games without him, they are 5-2. Their wins came against the Sacramento Kings. Expected the Spurs should have beat the Kings. They beat the Memphis Grizzlies. Again, you would expect the Spurs to beat them. They had a really good win, San Antonio, against the Atlanta Hawks that I talked about last week. And then, of course, beating the Blazers on the road, and then also coming back from 18 points and beating the Nuggets on the road were very key wins without Wemby. And then their losses, they did lose to the Suns. They've lost to the Suns both with Wemby and without Wemby. And then they also lost to Minnesota there on Sunday. So again, 5-2 so far in these first 7 games without Victor Wembanyama. On offense, they have the 5th-ranked offense of scoring 119.9 points per 100. They have the 19th-ranked defense, scoring 107 or allowing 117 points per 100. So again, that's the issue. There is you lose Victor, you're going to lose a lot of defense, and so that's been the problem. Their net rating is plus 2.9 points per 100, which is 13th. So what I've kind of just done is looked at the Spurs' numbers without Wemby and kind of just look at some overall takeaways of what's standing out on both ends of the floor without him so far. So the 3-point shooting on offense has been inconsistent, where they've had some pretty good nights shooting the 3 ball, but then they've had some very cold nights, as we saw against Minnesota. In the paint, for the most part, they're still getting their paint points pretty similar. Again, they have a lot of attacking players driving inside, like De'Aaron Fox, Dylan Harper, Keldon Johnson. Then they find Luke Kornet on rolls and cuts. So the paint scoring's been okay even without Victor. The free throws have been pretty inconsistent, where there's some nights they really don't get to the line at all, but then there's some other games where they have some very high free throw scoring nights, I guess you would say. And part of that player who gets attributed with those high free throw nights is De'Aaron Fox. There's been some games where he gets plenty of free throws. Assists have been something to watch. So the Spurs have had 3 games during the 7-game span of just tallying 17 assists, which is a very low number for a San Antonio team who's always been known for their ball movement. Those 17 assists were all season lows. So one thing I do want to note is when I look at the drives data, the players that are right now healthy and playing, these players are all more like shoot first kind of players, looking for the rim first on their drives. These are players like De'Aaron Fox, Dylan Harper, Harrison Barnes, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, and Julian Champagnie. Now, Vassell maybe not going to the rim, but at least going, and taking the mid-range. So these players, again, these are more players who are going to be preferring to shoot it first before looking to pass to a teammate. And so, I think this is one of those numbers, the 17 assists, where the Spurs really missed Castle and Wemby. So one thing to note when we look at the drives numbers is that Castle is actually passing more than shooting on his drives, again, creating more so for others. And then same thing for Wemby, where, yes, he also takes a lot of shots on his drives, but his percentage of shots on drives is much lower than some of these other players that I mentioned that are currently playing in games. So I think that low assist number is where you do see the Spurs kind of missing Wemby and Castle a little bit. So again, that's kind of where their numbers sit on offense in these 7 games. On defense, you do see that the Spurs are for the first time starting to see multiple double-digit deficits, and they're being tested and seeing how they react to those two falling behind by double-digit points. They faced 3 double-digit deficits against the Phoenix Suns, the Denver Nuggets, and the Minnesota Timberwolves. And obviously, we did see that they made that comeback against Denver, but they couldn't make that comeback against the Suns and the Wolves here. So again, that's something notable in these last 7 games, is that they are facing more double-digit deficits than usual. And before that, they had only faced 1 in that blowout loss to Phoenix earlier in the year. They've been kind of inconsistent on defense from the 3-point line during this 7-game span, where they've had some good games where the opponent doesn't shoot well, but then there's been some very bad ones, like how the Atlanta Hawks shot well from 3, the Denver Nuggets shot well, and of course the Minnesota Timberwolves. As far as the opponent's scoring in the paint, those numbers are also pretty high as well, as expected, with Kornet being the lone rim protector out there and kind of the deterring factor, there at the rim. So when he sits, the Spurs really struggle because they either have Kelly Olynyk playing the 5, who isn't known for his defense. He's more so a player who's going to help you out on the offensive end, or they have they go small ball with players like Jeremy Sohan at times. Even rookie Carter Bryant has got some minutes as a backup 5. So again, they're going to have some difficulty whenever Luke's out of the game. And so here's what the numbers look like now with no Wemby, but having Luke on the floor for at least 521 possessions, according to Cleaning the Glass. So the Spurs on defense are holding teams to 117 points per 100 per Cleaning the Glass, which is in the 42nd percentile. So again, not just barely under league average, but again, right there, barely under league average. And again, that's with Luke Kornet on the floor, but no Wemby. Now, when we look at no Wemby and no Luke Kornet at all on the floor in 484 possessions, this is like, you think about those lineups with like Olynyk, Sohan at center, Carter Bryant, maybe even Harrison Barnes at times has played some small ball center. Now, The defense is allowing 125.5 points per 100, 6th percentile. So again, bottom of the league whenever either Luke or Wemby are not on the floor. And so again, Luke can't play, all 48 minutes, with Wemby out right now. So that becomes an issue, is that they are having to, take a hit on defense right now in these games without Victor. And then of course, whenever Luke takes a break. As far as fouling, they're doing a pretty good job of not really putting the opponent on the free throw line too much. That hasn't really been an outlier for them on defense. And then as far as I would say, if we had to weigh, good defensive games versus bad ones without Wemby, I would say it's like 4-3. They're barely, right there, having 4 good defensive games and then 3 really bad ones. So again, it's kind of like having Luke Kornet. I think that's the big benefit of having him as a Wemby sub, is that he's going to kind of keep your defensive float as best as he can. And so that's kind of what we're seeing. I think like a year ago, maybe if Zach Collins is there or some of the other centers like Bismack Biyombo, I think this probably looks really bad. Maybe it's like 0-7 with bad defensive games without Victor and without Luke Kornet on the floor. And then also something else notable, which kind of makes sense with missing Victor's size out there, is that the opponent's second chance points have increased in these last 7 games without Victor. Let's keep going. All right, so before I close out this episode, let's look at the next 3 games for the Spurs this upcoming week before I record my next episode. So on Tuesday, the Spurs are back at home after a 4-game road trip where they are hosting the Memphis Grizzlies for the second time this season. The Grizzlies will be without John Morant for this game. Zach Edey is playing very well, where last week he earned Player of the Week nominations out west with his play. And so the Grizzlies are 9-12 overall, 9th out west. In their last 5 games, they are playing better basketball, going 4-1. They are 12th on offense in the last 5 and 9th on defense. Now, they've pretty much beat a lot of losing teams for 4 of their wins, and their only loss was to the Nuggets. So again, that's kind of something to watch, is that, the competition, they've been taking care of business, I guess you would say, against some bad competition. Then on Wednesday, the Spurs have a back-to-back in Orlando. So again, they play at home. They have to get on a flight and get to Orlando now for the next game. That's on Wednesday. The Magic are 12-8, 6th in the East. In their last 5 games, they are playing very well as well. 4-1. They're 3rd on offense and 10th on defense. So they've had some notable wins, beating some good teams. They've defeated the Detroit Pistons, the New York Knicks, and the Philadelphia 76ers in their last games. And then their only loss was to the Celtics. And then, of course, they beat the Clippers. But again, the Clippers aren't playing good basketball this season. So again, the Magic, I think, are going to be a tough test for the Spurs because they are playing good basketball right now. And then on Friday, the Spurs go on the road to play the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are 12-9 this season so far, 7th in the East. Not kind of meeting expectations from where they were kind of favorites in the East earlier this season. In their last 5 games, they are struggling. They are 2-3. They're 16th on offense and 11th on defense in their last 5 games. So their wins have only been in these last 5 games to losing teams, the Pacers and the Clippers, and then they've lost to some good teams out east like the Raptors and the Hawks, and then they also lost to the Celtics. So again, the Cavs are struggling right now heading into this game on Friday. Maybe they'll turn things around before the Spurs meet them on Friday. So if I had to give my prediction, I would say the Spurs are going to go 2-1. I would say that they defeat the Grizzlies, and I think they defeat the Cavaliers just because Cleveland is struggling right now. And I think the only game maybe they drop is the Magic for 2 factors. One, the Magic are, it is on the second night of a back-to-back in Orlando, plus the Magic are playing better basketball right now. And again, that's even, I'm going to say 2-1, even though we don't know if Wemby or Castle will be available for some of those games this week. So that wraps up this episode for the Spotted Pod. Thank you for listening. And the next episode should be up on Sunday, December 7th. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spotted Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.